Commander Dwight David Eisenhower, renowned hero of D-Day and the 34th President of the United States, was born on October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas. The third of 7 boys, he earned the nickname Ike from his parents, who used it as a diminutive of their last name. Interestingly, while all the Eisenhower boys were nicknamed some variation of Ike, only Dwight retained it into adulthood. His modest, working-class upbringing offered little indication of the grand achievements he would accomplish in the decades to come. Eisenhower was descended from German, English, and Scottish immigrants. His paternal ancestors were German Protestant farmers who emigrated to Pennsylvania in the 1740s. A branch of this family moved to Kansas in the 19th century, where David Eisenhower met his future wife, Ida Stover, at Lane University. They married in the autumn of 1885 and settled in Hope, Kansas, where David opened a general store and Ida gave birth to their first son, Arthur. The family business failed due to an economic downturn and dishonest business partners, forcing the Eisenhowers to relocate to Texas. David secured a job as an engineer on the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, earning $40 a month. They rented a small house in Denison and began to recover financially. During their years in Texas, Edgar and Dwight were born. In 1892, the family returned to Kansas, settling in Abilene, where David worked as a mechanic for the Bell Springs Creamery, earning $50 a month. Despite their modest circumstances, Dwight always considered Abilene his true hometown. The Eisenhowers raised their 6 sons in an 800-square-foot house on the wrong side of the tracks, but with enough land to grow subsistence crops and keep animals. Combined with David's salary, the family managed to support themselves. Dwight later reflected on his happy childhood, saying, "I never knew we were poor." The values stressed at home, responsibility, hard work, faith, humility, modesty, honesty, and sincerity, shaped his character. Each boy was assigned a plot of land to cultivate crops, which they sold to support the family. David responded to misbehavior with firm discipline, and Ike's quick temper often landed him in trouble. Religion played a significant role in the Eisenhower household. David and Ida were members of a Mennonite sect called the Brethren of Christ, known for baptizing in rivers. A religious shift occurred in 1895 after the death of their 5th son, Paul, from diphtheria. Ida began attending meetings of the International Bible Students Association, which later became known as Jehovah's Witnesses. She became more involved, and the group began holding meetings at the Eisenhower home. David and Ida encouraged their children in religious education and observance, holding daily Bible study sessions. Despite their pacifism, Dwight's fascination with military history persisted. By the time he left for college, he had read the entire Bible twice. While religion was central to his childhood, Ike never joined a church, preferring to keep his religious beliefs private. Some historians speculate that this was due to his mother's religious affiliation, which was considered radical at the time. The Eisenhower sons, all of whom achieved notable careers, likely wanted to protect their family's reputation. Abilene was a typical small American town, surrounded by vast rural expanses. This environment fostered Dwight's interest in the outdoors, particularly hunting and fishing. Despite the tough life for non-professionals, people believed in the possibility of success through hard work and honest dealings. This sense of opportunity likely contributed to Ike's confidence and later success. During his early education, Ike was an average student but enjoyed reading, particularly history and military exploits. Football became his passion, and his desire to play led him to risk his life after a leg injury, preferring to take a chance on recovery rather than amputation. He made a full recovery and continued to play football in high school and college. In 1909, Dwight and his older brother Edgar graduated from Abilene High School together. Due to limited family finances, Dwight worked at the creamery to support Edgar's education. with the understanding that Edgar would later support Dwight. After a year, Dwight entered the military academy, inspired by his love of military history and his active personality. In 1911, he was admitted to West Point Military Academy in New York. His college career was formative, teaching him the value of organization and leadership. Initially more interested in a college education in football, a knee injury ended his football career, leading him to coach the junior varsity team. Coaching fostered the general in him, bringing out his calm, strategic side. Eisenhower was a decent but not excellent student, excelling in English and history. He graduated 61st out of 164 students, but was admired for his eloquent writing. Despite his average academic and discipline records, he formed lifelong friendships that would prove crucial in World War II. Known as the class the stars fell on, many of his classmates became generals, including Omar Bradley. After graduation, Ike's military career began to take shape. He was posted to Fort Sam Houston near San Antonio, Texas, where he met and fell in love with Mamie Dowd. They married in 1916 and had their first son, Dowd, in 1917. Although he sought an active combat role, Eisenhower spent the next few years in junior officer training, coaching football, and serving in logistical roles. His organizational skills served him well, though he was repeatedly denied combat opportunities. Eisenhower's views on military development and his emerging leadership qualities brought him to the attention of influential military figures who mentored him. General Fox Connor, who he met at Camp Meade, was particularly influential, appointing Ike as his executive officer in the Panama Canal Zone. Connor believed another world war was coming, and that capable men like Eisenhower would be needed for high command. He encouraged Ike to read extensively on military history and strategy, preparing him for future leadership roles. Eisenhower's career during the interwar period was highly productive. His modern views on military development and his promise as a leader brought him to the attention of influential mentors. Despite his modest rank, he learned valuable lessons that would later serve him well. Eisenhower emerged from Connor's mentorship more confident in his perspectives and abilities and prepared to excel more than ever before. After returning to Camp Meade in 1924, Eisenhower, thanks partly to General Connor's influence, was admitted to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he studied Army tactics and operations and the problem-solving involved in managing them. Completion of General Staff School was necessary to rise in the Army ranks, and the curriculum was notoriously grueling. No longer simply an average student, in 1926, Ike graduated first in a class of 275. Connor intervened once again in 1927 to have Eisenhower assigned to the American Battle Monuments Commission in Washington, D.C., where he was tasked by General Pershing with writing a narrative history of the American Expeditionary Forces service in Belgium and France during World War I. Later that year, he was admitted to the Army War College in D.C., where he once again graduated first in his class in 1928. Ike and Mamie spent the next year in France, where Eisenhower was commissioned to tour and produce a guide of the First World War battle sites in France. He was then assigned to the War Department in D.C. and tasked with developing plans and strategies for industrial mobilization should another major war break out. In 1930, he met the newly appointed Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, whom he quickly impressed with his intelligence and competence. "This is the best damn officer in the Army," MacArthur once remarked about Eisenhower, and resolved, like General Connor before him, to promote Eisenhower's career. Like Connor, MacArthur believed another war could be on the horizon, and in terms of potential military leaders, Eisenhower was one of the most promising. Ike spent the 1930s working closely with MacArthur. As his assistant in Washington, Eisenhower helped to formulate policy and mobilization strategy for a potential upcoming war, according to MacArthur's vision. And in 1935, he accompanied the general to the Philippines, where MacArthur had been assigned to serve as military advisor to President Manuel Quezon. The Philippines were in a transitional period towards independence, and U.S. authorities were anxious that the region be defended from a potential invasion, which they worried might be launched by the Japanese. Eisenhower spent the next 4 years attempting to operationalize and implement MacArthur's plan for the Philippines' defense, one which required key regions to be reinforced, using a citizen army properly trained to fight, and which could be carried out with limited support and resources from the United States. The task was daunting, and the odds of success seemed bleak, but Eisenhower dutifully pursued his assigned goals and did the best he could under the circumstances. Unfortunately, the Philippines would fall to the Japanese by 1942 anyway. What made Ike's experience in MacArthur's service much more difficult was the political infighting among the Americans stationed there, and the personality clashes with MacArthur. But Ike had come a long way from being the hot-tempered young man spoiling for a fight. He had learned instead to compromise, conciliate, and negotiate. He was also noted for maintaining cordial relations with people he disagreed with, a skill he undoubtedly perfected in MacArthur's service. MacArthur was notorious for his irascible personality, and nearly a decade working with him effectively ruined all but the most professional part of the relationship between the two men. Eisenhower, however, proved to have truly mastered himself by having served so well under MacArthur. Ike's strong suit going forward would be his remarkable ability to deal diplomatically, patiently, and effectively with the many high-ranking Allied leaders and commanders, all of whom had to collaborate if they were to secure victory. And many of the Allied leaders and generals of the Second World War were famously difficult, even intolerable personalities. Churchill, de Gaulle, Stalin, Montgomery, and Patton, to name just a few, were all more than challenging to work with. And while they rarely expressed any unreserved approval of their international compatriots, virtually all had good things to say about Eisenhower, seeing him as infinitely competent, fair-minded, genuine, and trustworthy. By 1939, Ike was more than ready for a change, and he discreetly wrote to friends in Washington to help him find a new posting. He returned to Washington shortly after war was declared between Britain and Germany in September. He spent the next 2 years in multiple postings, both as a staff officer and in the field, advising and assisting in the expansion and mobilization of U.S. forces in preparation for a possible entry into World War II. He was given command of the Third Army and received acclaim and commendations for their successes against the Second Army in the 1941 War Games in Louisiana, after which he was promoted to Brigadier General. Here's a question for you. How would you handle working under a boss with a notoriously difficult personality, like MacArthur? Eisenhower did it for nearly a decade. Let me know your thoughts in the comments on how you would navigate such a challenging work environment. 5 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Secretary of War, General George Marshall, summoned Eisenhower to Washington and appointed him to head the War Plans Division, eventually giving him command of all U.S. forces in the European theater. It is possible that Ike had been shuffled around in so many different postings in the 2 years leading to U.S. entry into the war, because his performance in various roles was being carefully watched. Apparently, Marshall had decided that Ike was most valuable for his ability to plan, organize, and facilitate the execution of effective military policy and maneuvers. As Secretary of War, Marshall could not afford to promote men who would need to be micromanaged. Marshall needed eminently competent, responsible, accountable generals to whom he could delegate charge of the various large-scale operations and who could act confidently and independently in the moment when necessary. With his 2+ decades of experience, Eisenhower fitted the bill perfectly. Yet he now had a greater task before him than he had ever faced, and with little notion of just how great his challenges would be by the last months of the European theater, Eisenhower departed for London in June of 1942. Ike arrived in England with his work cut out for him. Not only nationalistic rivalry, but also unease and distrust clouded the interactions between the Allied military and political leaders. This made planning and cooperation challenging, but communicating effectively with prickly personalities and encouraging many conflicting elements to work together was Eisenhower's strong suit. He was given command of the Allied invasion of North Africa, launched in November of 1942. Accompanying Ike to North Africa was a pretty 33-year-old Irish divorcee named Kay Summersby. She had been assigned to Eisenhower as a driver after his arrival in London, and she remained with him as his personal secretary for the duration of the war. The nature of the relationship between Eisenhower and Summersby has been the subject of much historical controversy and debate. Away from the front, World War II was a very flirtatious time, and numerous members of the American military, both young privates and great generals, formed romantic relationships with British women. Ike and Kay clearly liked each other a great deal, but the exact nature of their relationship has never been fully clarified. Rumors abounded that they were having an affair and that Eisenhower would seek a divorce. However, Ike gave no sign of any such thing in the more than 300 letters he wrote to his wife, Mamie, while he was overseas. After Eisenhower's death, Kay published a memoir in which it was claimed that while there was a romance between them, they had never slept together. Whatever the truth of their relationship, Ike cut ties with Kay when the war was over, returning home to his wife and son. Eisenhower's first major challenge in the Second World War was the North African theater, and while the operation was ultimately a success, it was also plagued by missed opportunities, logistics problems, and painful mistakes. Ike ruefully observed that students at the General Staff College in Washington would be criticizing American performance in North Africa for decades to come. However, the general learned important lessons during the campaign, which he would carry forward with him through subsequent challenges. Operation Torch was the largest amphibious invasion in military history up until that time, and pitted General Eisenhower against the Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel. Rommel's forces had been struggling against the British Eighth Army led by General Montgomery in the Western Desert Campaign. The Allies took 3 key ports on the northwest coast, Oran, Casablanca, and Algiers, before proceeding east toward Tunisia. The Eighth Army in turn marched west, and by May 1943, the Tunisian campaign ended with the surrender of the Axis forces. Most were of the opinion that the North African theater of operations had continued for much longer than it should have. Eisenhower had been too cautious to proceed on multiple occasions and had not dealt decisively enough with personnel issues or supply problems. Although the Allies took over 250,000 German prisoners of war and were left in command of the field, Rommel and the bulk of his German forces had escaped. Eisenhower would confront the Desert Fox again, next time on the Western Front. One of Ike's greatest strengths was his ability to learn from his mistakes. Going forward, he resolved to act more decisively and to fine-tune all logistical and personnel relationships. He got tougher on himself as well as on the men serving under him, who nonetheless thought highly of him. Ike was not the inspirational sort of general. Many of the most admired generals were highly charismatic, temperamental men who inspired gut-level loyalty for their abilities, but often had near-intolerable personalities and diva-like attitudes. Eisenhower had famously had to interfere in a disciplinary scandal to keep the near-indispensable Patton from a court-martial after the abrasive general, disgusted at their shows of emotion, had physically assaulted 2 shell-shocked soldiers. Ike was not a fiery, charismatic sort, but he was admired for being plain-spoken, respectful, compassionate, honest, and genuine. While some soldiers might have dreamed of being commanded by a larger-than-life hero general, most soldiers thought of Eisenhower as being approachable, relatable, and fundamentally decent. By the end of the war, he was able to inspire his troops not only through his moral integrity, but also by projecting confidence and trust. The next challenge was the campaign in Italy, starting with the Allied invasion of Sicily in July of 1943. Operation Husky led to the toppling of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini and the country's surrender. The campaign then moved to the Italian mainland and carried on through 1944. Italy was an exceptionally challenging theater of war, and progress was slow, with repeated breakthroughs and setbacks. As ever, Ike was an excellent organizer and coordinator. He had learned to strike a balance between military and political considerations in his planning, strategy, and communications. It had been a daunting challenge to bring together the American, British, and Free French forces in North Africa, but his success there prepared him for the far larger challenge of building up the Allied presence in the European theater. Ike earned the confidence and respect of Allied political leaders who would rely on him to plan the invasion of France. The North African and Italian campaigns were regarded as complex and, overall, successful. As such, Eisenhower was promoted to Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Ike was now responsible for the Allied effort to retake German-occupied France and was given charge of the planning and coordination for Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history and the pivotal point in the European theater. Much of the success of Operation Overlord was due to Ike's exceptionally careful planning and his management and leadership skills. One of his most brilliant feats was the incredible secrecy and deception carried out prior to the invasion. The German forces were led to believe that the Allied invasion would land at the Pas de Calais, rather than at Normandy. The day of the invasion, June 6, 1944, was subject to a considerable number of delays due to the uncertainty of the weather, a major factor in an amphibious landing. Eisenhower was not only responsible for coordinating the vast and complex logistical and operational plans of the landings, but he also had to make the critical decision of whether or not to proceed. On the evening of June 5th, after much discussion with his subordinates, Ike decided to proceed with the invasion. He then sat down to write 2 letters, one of which would be sent to his superiors in Washington in the event the invasion failed, taking full responsibility for the disastrous outcome. Fortunately, the invasion was ultimately a success, and by the end of June, the Allies had taken Cherbourg and Caen and were pushing deeper into France. Consider this. If you had to plan the largest amphibious invasion in history, what would be your first step? Eisenhower faced this exact challenge with Operation Overlord. Reflect on it and share your strategies in the comments. The Allies were dealt a major setback during the Battle of the Bulge. At that time, it was the costliest battle in terms of casualties that American forces had ever fought. The German forces launched a counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest in December of 1944, and Allied forces took the brunt of the assault. Thanks to fierce resistance from the defenders of the critical Belgian town of Bastogne, as well as to the resolve of Eisenhower and his generals, the Germans were defeated by January of 1945. In May, the Nazis formally surrendered to the Allies, and the war in Europe was won. Much of the success of the European theater campaign could be attributed to the general whom everyone liked, trusted, and relied on. Ike returned to the United States in triumph and spent the next few years continuing to serve in the military as Chief of Staff of the Army. He spent some time in retirement after that, working on his memoirs, then briefly returned to service as NATO's first Supreme Commander in 1951. He was eventually convinced to return to public life and run for president. His amiable, approachable personality and reputation for honesty and integrity made him one of the most popular presidents of the 20th century. He led the country through the height of the Cold War, always taking care to strike a balance between diplomacy and the strategic use of military force, and to ensure he left the office and the country in better shape than he had found it. Ike passed away in 1969, greatly beloved by his country and remembered for his affability, patience, and pragmatic optimism. While Eisenhower lacked some of the personal flamboyance or charisma of some of his contemporary generals and political leaders, it is possible that this was part of what made him so effective. His firm, trustworthy, amiable character made people want to rely on him, and his gentle, diplomatic approach to command allowed him to handle complex conflicts and difficult personalities with ease. The end result was that his unpretentious genuineness and honesty made him easy to trust, like, and respect, and it left people with the confidence that everything was in good hands and would work out well. As we've seen, Eisenhower's journey from a modest beginning to a revered military leader is filled with remarkable moments and challenges. Which aspect of his leadership do you find most impressive? Let us know in the comments. If you made it this far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with more captivating historical stories. During his 2 years at Columbia University, Eisenhower had a mixed experience. He founded the Institute of War and Peace Studies to research the causes and consequences of armed conflict. Additionally, he established an informal council on foreign relations to deliberate on important foreign policy initiatives. These efforts provided Ike with rich opportunities for interaction with political, military, and intellectual leaders. However, Eisenhower faced challenges at Columbia. He found fewer opportunities to participate in educational policy formulation or to engage directly with students and faculty. Some members of the academic establishment looked down on him for his perceived lack of sophistication, exemplified by his preference for dime store Western novels. His limited involvement in the daily educational life of the university also led to some resentment. In 1950, he resigned from Columbia and returned to Europe to serve as the Supreme Commander of NATO. As Supreme Commander, Eisenhower spent a year advising America's European allies and helping to build a strong military coalition to stand against the rising forces of communism, defend democracies, and discourage future wars. Upon returning to the U.S. in 1951, he made a compelling appeal to Congress, securing firm support for NATO. Despite never having publicly aired any political opinions, Eisenhower's popularity led to a draft Eisenhower movement in the Republican Party. President Truman, who had offered support for Eisenhower's candidacy as a Democrat, was rebuffed when Eisenhower declared himself a Republican, leading to a permanent and bitter rift between the two. Eisenhower's decision to run for president was driven by concerns that his opponent for the Republican nomination, Robert A. Taft, was more focused on domestic policy and less on international security. Eisenhower's campaign was notably populist, with the catchy "I Like Ike" slogan resonating with voters. He won the 1952 presidential election in a landslide against Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson, capturing all but the southern states in the Electoral College and 55% of the popular vote. He repeated this success in the 1956 election, again defeating Stevenson with an even larger margin. As one of the oldest presidents elected in many decades, Eisenhower remained active, committed, and hardworking. He continued his hobbies, including reading, poker, bridge, attending sports events, and painting landscapes. Eisenhower's presidency featured massive economic growth, social change, and increasing international tension. While he prioritized foreign policy, his reticence to encroach on constitutional conventions and separation of powers has been seen by some as a lack of concern for serious social issues, particularly civil rights. Despite this, he implemented the desegregation of Washington, D.C., the armed forces, and the Foreign Service, and encouraged the recruitment of African Americans in government positions. However, his refusal to publicly condemn racist violence, like the murder of Emmett Till or the bombing of Dr. Martin Luther King's house, disappointed many civil rights leaders. Eisenhower's administration faced criticism for continuing Native American assimilation policies, which threatened their culture and way of life. Additionally, his failure to condemn Senator Joseph McCarthy's unconstitutional attacks during the Red Scare, which also targeted civil rights activists and the gay and lesbian community, was a notable shortcoming. Eisenhower loathed McCarthy personally, but only acted when McCarthy attempted to subpoena White House staff, invoking and defining the principle of executive privilege. Despite these controversies, Eisenhower's presidency is often praised for overseeing one of the largest economic expansions in American history, leading to unprecedented economic growth and improvements in the quality of life for many Americans. The automobile, construction, retail, and service industries flourished, unemployment reached historic lows, and consumerism boomed. American productivity and job creation owed much to World War II. Industries continued to benefit from infrastructure built during the war, such as the automobile industry. Democratic Party members claimed that their New Deal programs and the GI Bill, which Ike had no hand in, were key factors in America's healthy post-war economy. There is truth in these claims. Ike did not pioneer the farming subsidy programs, the the Social Security Administration, or the infrastructure to promote fair labor practices. He was not responsible for the GI Bill, which helped former soldiers and their families reach the economic equilibrium necessary to participate in the booming economy. However, Eisenhower did work to help facilitate the economic expansion in multiple ways. He disentangled private industries from government finances, many of which had become accustomed to receiving hefty government paychecks during the war for producing whatever was needed for the war effort. He also allowed tax rates for top earners, capital gains, and the wealthiest estates to remain high, a decidedly unconservative decision which brought him into conflict with members of his own party. A surplus of tax revenue allowed him to expand Social Security programs to benefit an additional 10 million American workers, providing them with access to unemployment insurance and pensions. Ike had never been the New Deal's biggest fan, particularly in his younger years. In fact, it was his exposure to Roosevelt's administration in Washington during the 1930s which hardened his largely conservative outlook. But by the 1950s, he was under no illusions about the benefits of the basic social welfare state. Any political party who tried to get rid of the New Deal programs now, he said, would never be heard from again. He described those who still aimed to deconstruct the New Deal as a negligible and stupid splinter group. Finally, one of Eisenhower's most significant contributions to America's economic expansion was his pioneering of the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Originally envisioned as a quick evacuation solution from densely populated urban areas in the event of a nuclear attack, the creation of the nationwide highway system opened up national markets for trade and shipping, put small towns on the map allowing them to grow, encouraged interstate leisure travel, and facilitated the creation of businesses to serve all highway travelers. Eisenhower's America enjoyed the world's highest standard of living during the 1950s. When it came to foreign policy, Ike faced the daunting task of representing America on the world stage at the dawn of the nuclear era. His perspectives on both communism and nuclear weapons had evolved since the end of World War II. Ike had been in Russia when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He had been horrified, believing it had done more harm than good. The Japanese, he thought, had been close enough to surrender to make the use of the atomic bomb unnecessary, although some historians continue to disagree on this point. He found it repugnant that the United States had been the first to use nuclear weapons. He was also of the opinion that the atomic bomb had done more than anything to make the Soviets distrust the Americans, leading to increasing tensions in the years ahead. Eisenhower was still hopeful during the immediate post-war period, believing that Russia wanted friendship more than competition with the United States. By 1948, however, the Russians had tested their first atomic bomb, and tensions over Germany's economic recovery and Greece's civil war had risen considerably. The Soviets seemed bent on expansion, and Ike's stance on communism therefore hardened. He began to believe, as his Republican contemporaries did, that an overall policy of containment backed by the threat of military action or nuclear strike was the best path to secure American interests and continued world peace. Impressions of Eisenhower's handling of the Cold War continue to vary. Modern critics mostly condemn the activities of the CIA, which Eisenhower approved during his administration, including the overthrow of elected governments in Iran and Guatemala, charging that these operations had less to do with containing communism than installing governments more friendly to U.S. economic interests. These actions made Iranian oil accessible to U.S. and British companies and prevented the nationalization and equitable distribution of land among Guatemalans to facilitate the dominance of large-scale, corporate, American agricultural interests in the region. Containment of communism in Latin America and the Middle East continued to be a feature of American foreign policy in the years to come. The Eisenhower Doctrine, which offered military support to Middle Eastern countries determined to resist Soviet communism, profoundly affected the stability and geopolitics of the Middle East region during Eisenhower's presidency. He was praised for his contribution to solving the Suez Crisis in Egypt, but overall American policy in the Middle East has frequently been criticized for being at cross purposes with Arab countries, who viewed Zionist imperialism as a far greater threat than communism and who deeply resented American and British support for Israel. In principle, Eisenhower was more in favor of liberating communist countries than in containing them, but he understood that one could not constantly go to war in this new age of warfare. This is evident in his handling of the Korean War, his subsequent strategy of nuclear brinkmanship with Communist China, and his policy in Southeast Asia. The death of Stalin greatly facilitated the resolution of the Korean War, as it left a temporary power vacuum which rendered China more vulnerable to U.S. military threats, which Eisenhower did not hesitate to employ to force China to withdraw from the Korean Peninsula. Subsequently, Eisenhower was instrumental in formulating the U.S. policy of support for Taiwan against encroachments by Red China. Unwilling to commit more than funding and military advisors to the defense of French Indochina, later South Vietnam, Eisenhower's initially minimal commitment to defeating communism in Vietnam would eventually snowball under the subsequent Kennedy and Johnson administrations into an arduous and undeclared war that would take the lives of 50,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese troops and civilians. Kennedy also inherited the task of executing the Bay of Pigs invasion, planned by the Eisenhower administration, which spiraled into the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Because Ike's foreign policy discouraged the pursuit of all-out war, his strategy for dealing with the expansion of Soviet influence and nuclear capability involved intricate negotiation and the building and maintenance of America's own nuclear arsenal and capabilities. Admirers of Eisenhower praise his efforts at nuclear disarmament, however unsuccessful they may have proven to be. When the Soviets exploded their first hydrogen bomb, Eisenhower went against the advice of his cabinet to propose mutual nuclear disarmament with the Soviets. The campaign was called Atoms for Peace and suggested that the two superpowers might agree to decommission their weapons, using them instead to create nuclear power plants for the benefit of both countries. Ike consistently tried to avoid the one-upmanship of the arms race with the Soviets, but also did not hesitate to enlarge the U.S. nuclear stockpile as the Russian arsenal increased. Eisenhower's open skies policy and proposed mutual inspections were also met with Russian refusal. Ultimately, neither side was willing to be the first to establish real trust by disarming first, or by being the first to permit UN-supervised nuclear inspections. The Eisenhower administration was significantly embarrassed by the U-2 incident when they approved one last illegal and covert surveillance flight of the Soviet Union prior to a summit with the Russians. Khrushchev promptly produced the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, whose plane had been shot down over Soviet airspace, and who confirmed that Eisenhower had lied when he denied the existence of the U-2 flight. Furious at Ike's unabashed refusal to apologize for the incident, Khrushchev promptly canceled the summit and rescinded Eisenhower's invitation to visit the Soviet Union. Throughout his presidency, Eisenhower grew to resent the absurdly high price tag for America's foreign policy. He had massively defunded America's conventional military forces and poured money into the development of a nuclear strategy which paradoxically kept Americans safe using the principle of assured mutual destruction. The space race eventually came to seem excessive to him as well, and Ike referred to any administration that could spend $40 billion on a race to the moon as nuts. Ike reached the end of his presidency concerned above all about what he referred to as the military-industrial complex and its potential to hijack and erode American democracy. He had tried hard to end the excessive allocation of government and military funding to private companies after World War II, but in the thick of the arms race with the Soviets, he had not been able to prevent weapons manufacturers, who grew more powerful every year, from claiming an increasingly enormous share of American tax money for the weapons they produced. When his presidency was over, Eisenhower handed the reins of government to Kennedy, who had emerged victorious against Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, in the 1960 election. Accompanied by Secret Service detail, Ike and Mamie departed the White House for their farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Ike's retirement was both pleasant and fairly active. It meant much more time with Mamie, their son John, and their grandchildren. He wrote 3 more memoirs between 1963 and 1967 and continued his hobbies and pursuits, including poker, bridge, landscape painting, and a rather newer hobby for him, golfing. He also continued his support for Republican electoral candidates in his retirement. Eisenhower's health had begun failing as early as 1955, when he had his first heart attack, although Vice President Nixon and Eisenhower's cabinet had done everything possible to minimize the president's health problems to the media. Ike suffered no less than 4 more heart attacks over the next 10 years, the last of which left him fairly debilitated, and he was permanently hospitalized by 1968. Dwight Eisenhower died of heart failure on the 28th of March 1969 at the age of 78. His coffin lay in state in the rotunda of Washington's Capitol building for several days before he was laid to rest in his beloved hometown of Abilene, Kansas, in the grounds of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. He is buried next to his wife, Mamie, and their beloved first son, Icky. Like most other globally prominent figures of the 20th century, probably the most turbulent century of the modern period, Eisenhower has a complicated and frequently debated legacy. As one of the greatest heroes among the Allies in the Second World War, Eisenhower's contributions to victory give him indisputable historical importance and place him shoulder to shoulder with the Allies' greatest generals like Montgomery and Patton, and alongside political leaders like Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and de Gaulle, in terms of his influence. It is therefore interesting that while biographies on Eisenhower began to appear almost immediately following the end of World War II, and many more have been published in the decades since, Ike is in fact a great deal less visible in popular culture, iconography, and historical biography compared to these other prominent personages. Historians documenting his political record during the 1960s and immediately following his death were fairly critical of his presidency, particularly his silence or relative inaction on civil rights issues, or what they perceived as his limited success in preventing escalation of the Cold War. By the late 1970s and 80s, however, the conservative tide of politics had risen once again in the West, and new perspectives were offered by historians seeking to rehabilitate Eisenhower's reputation from the criticisms of earlier historians. Many of these more conservative historians attributed greater political skill to Eisenhower than he had previously been credited with. Eisenhower post-revisionists agree with this assessment, but criticize his performance as a political party leader, accusing him of failing to cultivate unity within the Republican Party or to sufficiently support Nixon in the 1960 election against Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. This seesaw of historical perspectives continues, yet Eisenhower consistently continues to rank among the top 10 best U.S. presidents across multiple polling sources. His greatest admirers continue to tout his presidency as a period of exceptional economic and infrastructural development, and affirm that with Ike at the tiller, the NATO alliance held, communism remained fairly well contained, and the Cold War remained cold. Some go as far as crediting Eisenhower with the prevention of a Third World War. Deeper research and examination of this fascinating man is certainly called for. Although many commentators have judged his politics as significantly right-wing, Ike himself claimed to represent, in his own words, a political philosophy of progressive conservatism.